Hello and welcome back to another Archaeo-Scope. Now, as ever, this series really is me asking you questions. It's sort of inverse, rather than you asking me questions or us exploring the past. I'm asking a question of the people who watch this video in order to try and find a sort of a meta answer. Together we come up with the answer, or at the very least have an interesting discussion. And well, the topic of today's Archaeoscope is, well, it follows a conversation that I had with my brother-in-law last week. We were relaxing in the sun here on the veranda of Archaeo-Scope Towers, having a nice cold beer, and we were talking about, I believe actually, we were talking about science fiction. And then it dawned on us, a very big question actually, I think, and the question is, at what point did we start telling stories about the future? That is, human beings. When did we start to tell stories about what's going to come next as opposed to what has been in the past? Now, I posted this question as a status on the Archaeo-Scope Facebook page and got some fairly interesting answers actually, ranging from the very earliest days of humanity, people talking about where, if they're on a journey, for example, maybe even leaving Africa, talking about where they may well end up. But we can't really prove that, and many stories since then seem to focus on the past or the present. So there's no real evidence that stories about the future existed back then. I'm not saying they didn't, but we can't necessarily show it. Another suggestion was based around prophecy, or people talking about the end of days. But that doesn't really, again, doesn't quite fulfill the question that we're pondering, in as much as these aren't really stories about the future, they're stories about the end. So they tend to be rather illustrative, ambiguous, one could argue, and they tend not to be about how we get to the end of days, but rather the end of times. So it's not really looking at the next step, or even 100 years' time, 200 years' time for humanity. It's more about the end. Or, for example, religious prophecies often tend to be illustrative, and they often use current or current then, contemporaneous imagery to express what is being prophesied. So again, you don't have prophecies which talk about, for example, skyscrapers explicitly, or cars or aeroplanes, this kind of thing. Now, I asked some other people as well. I had a bit of a chat with Mrs. Soup, and she being originally a classicist trained at Oxford, and she thought, no, I can't think of any, for example, classical Roman Greek stories about the future. And this is continued to be with me, and this is why I thought I'd make a video about it. Because stories have been important since the very earliest times of humanity. They are a way of anchoring ourselves to the past and also passing on vital information. A story may well be told about, for example, how to make a sword, or how fire was discovered, and therefore tell you about how to do it. It is an instructional story, perhaps. A story may well tell you how to live in your society. Again, an instructional story. It's instructive through the use of a situation told via a story, and informs you what to do and what not to do in given situations. Stories are also used in pre-writing civilizations, or in writings with in civilizations with an oral history, to convey a sense of the past to people who were listening. So this is where we have come from, this is how we have come to be here. But they almost never, as far as I can tell, or indeed they never, seem to look forward. These stories don't tend to be about the future. And thus, the question is very interesting. When did we start looking into the future with films like Back to the Future, this kind of thing, or indeed any number of science fiction series today? Well, future studies, futurology as some people call it, really emerged in the 1960s. So an avid attempt, a serious attempt to try and extrapolate what the future will be, really only emerged in the last 50 or 60 years. But some people have attempted to argue that the attempt to see sort of grand patterns in society is actually quite old, and that perhaps you could look back to the Han Dynasty and Su Ma Xian, a person who was trying to see a sort of a pattern for social change back in the 145 to 90 BC. That could be seen as an early attempt to see or to try and gauge a trajectory for society. But again, it's not really making predictions. It's more trying to understand the pattern, rather than, for example, talking about teleportation or hover cars or time travel, this kind of thing. Now, speaking of time travel, one thing that did come to mind during the conversation I had with my brother-in-law was things like books, for example. So The Time Machine, H.G. Wells' classic, is from 1895, so that's fairly early. Jules Verne often talked about technology and adventure in the mid-19th century, so the 1860s. For example, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was a fantastical idea, a fantastical vision of what might be possible. And at the same time, people were telling stories about, for example, going to the moon 100 years or more before we actually went to the moon. So arguably people have been looking forward, certainly, from that point onwards. And maybe what we're talking about here is a phenomenon linked with the observation that technology is making leaps and bounds. Perhaps when technology was flooding into our homes, when gas heating, electricity, pollution linked with technological change, cities were rising up where cities had not been previously. For example, great industrial cities like Manchester in England, this kind of thing. Perhaps this is when people started to think about, wow, well, my father didn't see this. I wasn't alive. This city was not here when I was born. Sorry. When he was in his prime, this was all fields and countryside. Now look at it, it's a great big city. Maybe that's what we're seeing, is a reaction to an observed, fast-paced change in society. And therefore people start to think, well, what's going to happen next? Who knows? Whereas arguably, technological change, though people make the assumption that barely anything changed in the deep past, technological change seemed to be much slower in the deep past, and therefore perhaps people didn't make the assumption that the future would be drastically different than the present. Now, this also brings to mind, in a slightly comedic sense, a TV series that I used to watch when I was a child called Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. It's well worth a watch. Go and check it out on YouTube. But also, in it, you have moments where Marian has these moments of insight, and she'll have sort of visions about the future, almost sort of streams of consciousness really about the future. So there's one that sticks with me certainly, where she talks about how their adventures will be watched on a magical box in the future, and people will be able to see it in their homes. Essentially, she's describing a television, but that sort of comedic device, while very effective, there's no evidence that people, even in the Middle Ages, were aware that there would be a drastically different future to the times that they were living in. In fact, for many people in the Middle Ages, they saw themselves as a continuation of the classical world. They drew a direct line from Rome through Charlemagne, through various other dynasties and rulers and political institutions to their times. So again, they were looking back and they drew on the past to talk about the present and to define the present. There's very little, or rather, as far as I can tell, no evidence that people in the Middle Ages even looked forward and told stories about the future. Now, this has been an ongoing question, or rather a slightly rambling question that I've been asking in that sense, and I've thrown in lots of seeds, lots of ideas that have certainly just come to mind over the past couple of days. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this question. When did we start looking to the future and telling stories about the future? When did we start making up fiction, essentially? Things which have not happened yet, technology which cannot exist yet, planets even, which we don't even know exist, which don't exist, but we tell stories about them. When did that begin? And I wonder if we can trace a moment in time, or try to trace a moment in time, or a period of history when we started to look forward for fiction as much as we look backwards for fiction, and indeed to the world around us. Because stories are crucial to humanity. Everyone ultimately has a story and becomes a story. But at what point did we start to take stories from that which is not yet been? That's something I do find fascinating. I thought it was well worth thinking about, and therefore I thought I'd share it with you via Archaeo-Scope. So hopefully this hasn't been too much of a chore tracing my line of thought through this video, but these are just some of the things which have come to mind, and I think it's a very interesting question. So, with that in mind, please do have a think, have a chat with your friends and family, and comment below. Let me know what you think. Indeed, let others know what you think, and have a chat about it, because I think it's worthwhile considering. Because in some ways, this could be a thing which defines our age. As much as, yes, technology, new technologies are defining our age, and technology is always defined, or rather is used, to define previous ages. Maybe our perspective on our place in time, and indeed the future, is something which marks out current humanity as being distinct from previous humanity. Technological advancement, well, technology advances. Knowing your place in the past and being able to critique that, well, people have always done that. But have people always looked to the future? My suspicion is probably not. Anyway, I have elucidated this enough. Go and have a think, and please do comment below. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.